Thank you. Firstly, can I say welcome everyone to this session. Corruption is, as we all know, one of the most difficult and challenging things with which we all now have to deal. We have today with us an extraordinary, powerful panel. And I hope that what they will do in their 10 to 15 minute presentation is to set out the waterfront for us. But if I can just say to colleagues that the most important part of this session, I believe, will be the interaction that will come from the question and answer session, which I hope we'll use as a sort of brainstorming opportunity to test out and tease out some of the most difficult issues with which we all face. As we all know, corruption can take many forms, but its consequence always appears to be the same. It creates division and undermines confidence in the public. It is present when the rule of law is absent, and in every democracy it has to be eradicated, because failure to do so brings about real destruction of the citizens' quality of life, their sense of fairness, parity of treatment, belief in justice, and it really undermines the sense of community. And sometimes, as I think happened in the case of the Arab Spring, countries can fail fatally. So I think it is everybody's business, and it should never be seen nor left as the preserve of the political or institutional elite, no matter how gifted, fiscally competent, or well-intentioned. So creating a culture which is resistant to bribery and corruption needs a multi-layered and multidisciplinary approach where every participant understands the impact of their acceptance or toleration of corrupt practices of those who may surround them, and that, in truth, silence is collusion. And it's a hard message, and one which is unpalatable to many who, innocent themselves of poor practice, would rather look the other way because challenge and confrontation is too difficult to contemplate. So I think I should make plain straight away that, in my view, simply having an anti-corruption commission cannot be and should never be seen as a panacea. Financial corruption costs us over 1 trillion globally. Organised criminals and the crime they commit are becoming ever more ingenious in nature and ever more deviant, pushing boundaries, aided by technology which has proved to be capable of several different uses, and not all of them good. So technology can shield wrongdoing as easily as it can be used as a sword to pierce the veil behind which the corrupt hide. And money is at the heart of organised crime, and the lifestyle and the status it brings is the main motivation of most criminals, and those who engage in corrupt practices are no different. And just as legitimate businesses need funding to stay afloat, so does organised crime. So without cash flow, deals can't be made and people can't be paid. For both these reasons, many organised criminals fear attacks on their finances and lifestyle more than prison. So asset recovery has become a key to defeating the criminal or the corrupt, who seek to encase themselves in lawfare and use their assets, which can rival the gross national product of many developed states. So the legislation created to enable law enforcement officers to pursue these ill-gotten gains has become one of the most important tools in the toolkit available to fight and hopefully eventually prevent corruption. Certainly, most of those of us who have been privileged to discharge the responsibility, either as ministers of justice or as attorney generals, or in any way connected to the justice system, have understood how important international cooperation has to be. We all have to struggle to find a standard which is globally accepted, implementable, and clear. I think that we are moving closer to that understanding now. The Bribery Act in this country, which I was one of the architects of, is now starting to be looked at as a standard which could be applicable global. So our global appreciation of what corruption means and how we can fight it, I think, is of fundamental importance. Now, we have, as I have indicated, 4 speakers. Because of the importance of what they are going to say, I am going to restrict my opening remarks to those which I have now made. You'll be delighted to know that there is about another half an hour of intense, detailed, structured analysis of the law in relation to this area, which I had prepared for you, but I am not going to delight you with it this morning. Because I think there are a number on our panel who it is much more important for you to hear from. So I'm cutting my minutes to be able to give one of my colleagues to my left a little more time, but also I hope to enhance your opportunity to ask questions, and in due course I hope to be able to participate in those questions too. Now, the first to speak this morning is Lawrence Cockcroft, who is the co-founder of Transparency International. All of you know of the sterling work that Transparency International have done in this area and its importance. So I will go straight to Lawrence, or Laurence, perhaps is more accurately.
Not what my mother had in mind. Can I be sure this mic is on? Yes. Yeah, good morning. Thank you very much, Baroness Scotland. It's very nice to be chaired by you because, as you say, you did play a very important role in getting the Bribery Act through, a piece of legislation which was the culmination of a lot of work by many different parties, one of whom was TI. I'm anxious in this talk to move the agenda on, and I realize that in the last session you touched on a number of aspects of corruption. I have no intention of recapping on those, but if it appears to be covering some of the same ground, then I will rapidly speed over it. I was asked before I go into, as it were, the nitty-gritty of what I'm going to say a few words about the origins of Transparency International, which I'm happy to do. I won't bore you with any detail, but TI is, as Josie Ugaz just said, 20 years old. It was formally established in 1993 with an international secretariat in Berlin and a series of national chapters. And I think all that I really want to say at this stage is I believe the strength of TI over the last 20 years has been that we are based on national chapters which now operate in 100 countries. And those are all membership-based organizations, so that when TI speaks, if I may put it that way, it has the support of chapters around the world. So this is not, as you might say, a northern entity, and for that matter, neither is it a southern entity. The concept behind TI was always that international corruption takes 2 or 3 to tango, and that therefore it would be essential to have a kind of coalition of interested parties in both North and South. And I think that's worked well. If anybody would like to ask any questions about that, either during the session or immediately afterwards, please feel free to do so. But I don't think we're here to talk about the structure of TI. I think the most difficult issue in really thinking about corruption is the way in which different factors interact. And I think the puzzle in dealing with corruption is to try and disentangle those factors. So what do I mean by that? I'm going to discuss about 6 different key issues that I often describe as the principal drivers of corruption, actually everywhere, but certainly in countries where corruption is endemic. So the first of those is something you've already been touched on, which is political finance. And I mean that in the broadest sense, both political finance in regimes that are not really democratic, where somebody needs to keep him or herself in power by whatever means and needs to have the funds to do that. But more broadly, I mean the context in which in democratic and semi-democratic countries, parties need to raise finance from one source or another. And that is a huge issue. And I'm going to talk about that in a little more detail in a moment, but I want to give you a sense of the 6 drivers that I'm talking about, first of all. And then we have the phenomenon which is variously described as petty bribery, sometimes retail bribery, but here I'm talking about the bribery that all of you know takes place in at least half the countries of the world, where it's necessary to pay off a policeman, or even to get a place in a hospital, or sometimes to get a child from primary school to secondary school, and where citizens encounter bribery as a fact of life, at least for the sake of argument, once a week. So what do I mean? How do I evidence that? TI Kenya, which is the branch of the chapter of TI in Kenya, has twice done a survey in Nairobi of the percentage of people's income which they pay in this kind of small-scale bribery. And the answer has come up twice as 15%. And actually TI chapters in other parts of the world, including Latin America and South Asia, have come up with a very similar conclusion. So I don't need to remind any of you in this room, I'm sure, that that is a key issue for many people. Sometimes people, particularly from the West, go to a country and they say, well, we don't really mind paying because actually these guys got to survive and they're on very low incomes. But I think you again may agree that in a number of cases, I wouldn't necessarily say the majority, this can be an organized scam. So there are many cases in the public domain where police chiefs in a particular city have demanded that those policemen on the beat come back every week or every day with a certain sum, which is then goes straight to the police chief, and in some cases further up the chain. This is a very well documented, and I think we need to recognize that. Maybe more importantly, and particularly from a business point of view, there are many examples where people complain about having to pay a bribe at a port to get a container through. But actually this is not an offhand bribe to somebody who may or may not be working in the docks. It's actually a systematic problem for the port master and the port manager. And many attempts to reform docks in different parts of the world have come up against the problem of dealing with that. So I think petty bribery is a big issue. Organized crime, I think in the debate about corruption, tends to get underrated. Jose Ugaz just now mentioned the issue of organized crime, and he's very strong on that question, and I would like to reiterate what he said without repeating it, which is that in many cases organized crime is either buying individual politicians or in some cases running a complete slate. And what do I mean by that? If you look at the all the material on the political system in India, you will find a huge amount in the public domain which argues that mafia groups, particularly in Mumbai, but elsewhere, have actually bought politicians on a huge scale. And at least in the days when the Congress Party was running India, had a big say in outcomes. So organized crime is very important. It's not a phenomenon related to the South. In Italy, thinking not so much of the Sicilian mafia, but thinking of the 'Ndrangheta in Calabria, in the heel of Italy, are a very powerful group that is now considered by Europol to be very active, not only in northern Italy, but also in Germany. So this is a big issue everywhere. And if you look at some frightening figures in relation to wildlife reduction, a phenomenal figure in Tanzania of reductions of about 70% in the herd of elephants in the last 10 years. That is certainly undoubtedly implemented by what we might call organized crime, because groups are managing to control hunting grounds and access ivory in that way. Then multinational corporations during the last 15 years have undoubtedly become much more receptive to the fact that international bribery legislation exists. So this is obviously not only the Bribery Act in this country, more importantly it's the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the UK, and now all OECD member states have similar legislation, which is variously effective. We can talk about that if anybody wants to ask questions about it. But I now want to draw your attention not so much to the question of bribery by multinational corporations, although that's very important, but more to the question of illicit payments. And I think my colleague, Honourable Irene, is going to talk about this more explicitly because she's a member of the Mbeki panel that is working on this question. But it is a huge issue in the sense that many multinational companies involved in trading in commodities such as timber will be registering the price of timber at a level below the world price, which means that income which is chargeable for tax purposes in the exporting country is less than it should be. Secondly, they're holding that income in an offshore center such as the Cayman Islands and only repatriating it to, for example, France, UK, or the US over time to ensure lower tax rates. So this is a situation where both the exchequers in the north and the south are losing out, which opens up the whole question of secrecy jurisdictions, sometimes known as offshore centres. And I think it should be a source of embarrassment to any UK citizen to recognise that about a third of the 35 secrecy jurisdictions listed by OECD are under some form of UK jurisdiction in one way or another. And we can come perhaps in the discussion time to what the UK government is doing about that. Of course, there is finally some movement on that issue. But there's no doubt, and the figure was used of $1 trillion a year in the earlier session, there's no doubt that the role of secrecy jurisdictions as an incentive to corruption, because it means that during the last several decades, people have been able to squirrel away the fruits of corruption in secrecy jurisdictions with purely nominal tax rates, has been a big issue. And then finally, I want to raise something that is a bit more subtle, if you will bear with me. And it's a thought which isn't often registered. I want to just mention the fact that in many developing economies, the informal sector is very crucial. So by that, I mean that part of the economy which is not recorded in a normal sense. So I'm here talking about everything from street traders to small businesses and sometimes larger companies who dwell in the informal sector. Now, if you think about it, that means that they can make a payment to, say, the city government without that being recorded. So I'm sure in many of your countries you'll recognize a situation where somebody goes off from the city government to a very small business, says that you've been levied for tax at such and such a rate, but if you give me a cash payment, it'll be fine. But actually it's not fine, because that is one of the main sources of corruption on an everyday basis, and it's a really big problem which is underrated. And I know there are lots of problems about registering the informal sector, and attempts to do that in the past have proved quite difficult, but nonetheless it is a big issue. So those are my drivers. I'm very keen not to talk for too long, so I'm going to mention a couple of other things before moving on to the issue of what to do about political finance. But I just want to mention that political finance is a huge issue everywhere. I know it's an issue in many of the countries that you represent. It's an issue here, and it's particularly dramatic right now in the United States. I've just spent 2 weeks in the US talking to people concerned about political corruption in America, and I think it's the first time that it's been such an open debate. And the word corruption is being used in the US press and media virtually every day during the midterm elections which have just taken place. So the idea that this problem of political corruption is something to do with emerging economies is out. That's completely off the agenda. This is now an international problem. How do you finance modern politics? So what's the issue? In 2012, the best estimates of total expenditure in the US around the presidential election, around the midterm elections, was $6.3 billion. And this time it's expected to be significantly above that. So these are really huge sums. Of that, the two brothers, the Koch brothers, whom you may have heard of, who were very successful businessmen in the energy sector, contributed $407 million in 2012. So there are very, very active players who might be described as oligarchs. We're all very keen to describe Russian emigres in London as oligarchs, but actually this is a case where in the US we have oligarchs who are playing a mega role in political outcomes, which I think is increasingly resented. So it's a hot topic. But just to put that in perspective, in India, the last election in 2009 cost $1.5 billion, and the best estimates in this year were $3 billion. So we might say that for a general election in India is now half the cost of a midterm election in the US. So these are very big problems. What is there to be done about it? I would say I want to make 5 points, and then I'm sure that we need to move on within the panel. First of all, we need to have a cap on donations. In other words, there has to be a ceiling on what an individual or an organization can contribute. We have a very good organization here called the Committee for Standards in Public Life, which has been chaired by Sir Christopher Kelly, who reviewed only about a year ago the issue of political finance. And that committee recommended that maximum donation should be £10,000. So that makes a whole swathe through donations of multi-millions. But that's not something that has yet been built into UK legislation, and frankly, I doubt if it will be. Secondly, we need to have prohibitions or limits on corporate and anonymous donations. So one needs to take into account the issue both of corporate donations and how that's done. In the US, it's often done indirectly through political action committees, and anonymous donations, which above, say, a very small sum like £100, should probably be eliminated. And then thirdly, there needs to be full public disclosure of public finance so that people can see on the internet or elsewhere who has contributed to which party. Then fourthly, some public funds. This is a controversial area, and in many countries people are unhappy with it, but some combination of public funds from which a party with a legitimate number of seats in a given parliament can draw on public funds probably needs to be a part of political finance. I know that's controversial. You might like to raise points about that. And then finally, one needs to have an effective electoral body that is monitoring elections, and those differ hugely. Sometimes they operate with extreme goodwill but are very ineffective, which is pretty much the case, for example, in countries as different as Uganda and India. And sometimes they are quite effective, but it's a big problem everywhere, and not all electoral registration bodies are as effective as they could be. So these are big issues. I won't say any more now, but that's the agenda I would like to ask you to focus on.
Thank you very much indeed, Lawrence. We're now going to move swiftly to Dr. Gavin Woods. Many of you will know that he has a very illustrious career in banking, politics, academic research. He taught as a professor of ethics and public finance at Stellenbosch University and as a senior research fellow university in Amsterdam. So I'm going to go straight to Robin, just so that the speakers are aware. I'm going to have 2 circles. One says 2 minutes, which I will show, and the next will say time up, just to help. Thank you very much. Gavin.
Thank you, Chairperson. Perhaps I should start with a small correction. While I believe I remain an honourable person, I no longer have the title in my country, having been now a former Member of Parliament. On behalf of GOPAC, the Global Organisation of Parliamentarians Against Corruption, I'd like to thank the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association for the invitation to participate in this important conference. And given the central role and purpose of GOPAC, I think it's appropriate that we, with the membership now spreading across 50 countries, engage with organisations such as the CPA, who we know to share our concerns around public sector corruption and share our belief that parliamentarians have a role to play in the combating of this scourge. This is all the more so given evidence that public sector corruption has become more extensive and more pervasive over the past 20 years, and that this not only undermines good governance across state institutions, but at a more macro level is seen to be hurting economic development in many, many countries. Staying with the issue of development, especially in poorer countries, I see that from the briefing notes given to me by the conference organisers that they would like me to comment on an open letter which was signed by GOPAC's executive director, together with 24 other high-profile humanitarian and public interest organisations and individuals, and which was given to the G20 leaders at their summit in Brisbane last week. The letter amounts to a joint plea to the world's most powerful leaders, asking for their intervention and for the establishment of a fairer and more honest global financial system in respect of how capital and money flows take place between countries, an issue that has been aired a number of times already today. The joint statement, backed by authoritative information, directs itself to the corrupt ways in which huge sums of money are transferred between countries, especially by companies engaged in money laundering, tax avoidance schemes, and other illicit and illegal corporate transactions. The letter stresses the concern that these flows are invariably from poor to rich countries, leaving the poorer countries with considerably less reserves with which to pursue their developmental agendas. The signatories appeal to the G20 leaders to find the political will to implement what they, the signatories, believe would be effective regulations, including greater transparency, through which to limit this serious injustice. So it is a heartfelt call, with the world's poor in mind, to those who to date have been less than responsive to the situation. And may I, opportunistically perhaps, remind you of the theme of this conference, which refers to the role of parliamentarians in managing growth for equitable development, and express GOPAC's hope for a strong collective parliamentarian voice on the issue. Now, notwithstanding my being here as a GOPAC representative, I've also been asked to speak, perhaps from a more independent perspective, on subject matter which is specific to my home country, South Africa. The subject here concerns the measures South Africa has taken to curb corruption. And the relevance of this subject to the conference can be noted from the evidence of how such corruption can deter investment, lower employment, hurt international trade, lead to the misallocation of resources, reduce competition, increase the cost of doing business, cause higher taxes, affect the delivery of public services, and lower the morale and motivation of public servants. Such consequences make clear how big a threat public sector corruption can be to the developmental well-being of a country. Now, South Africa, as you might know, is considered to be amongst the more corrupt countries in the world, and there's an abundance of research-based opinion as to why this is the case, but which time constraints do not allow me to go into today. However, in recognizing the scale of the problem in South Africa, the South African government has employed an ever-growing range of corruption-combating measures, although to limited effect. And for convenience, I'll refer to the measures taken, particularly in relation to public sector corruption, in terms of external and internal measures. That is, measures which are either external or internal to the individual government institution, the individual institution where corruption actually takes place. South Africa has concentrated on external measures in the hope of creating a general environment which would frighten perpetrators of corruption into submission. In this regard, has gone further than most other countries in its introduction of wide-ranging anti-corruption type laws and regulations. Amongst there is the Prevention and Combating of Crime Activities Act, which is South Africa's equivalent of the FTPA and the UK's Bribery Act of 2010, an act which serves to criminalise corruption, bribery in particular, and establishes a sanctions regime. The Whistleblowers Act, the Prevention of Organised Crime Act, Financial Intelligence Centre Act, to name a few. Then there are acts which establish and give strong mandates to about 5 different agencies which are there specifically to investigate corruption. And in addition, the South African government has established a National Anti-Corruption Forum, an Anti-Corruption Coordinating Committee, and an Interministerial Committee in order to drive its anti-corruption efforts. Then there's the National Anti-Corruption Hotline, which the conference briefing notes again ask me to make mention of. We refer to this by its acronym, which is NACH, NACH, and it's an extremely established initiative. It's basically a whistleblowers facility, which is believed to be amongst the most well-designed and sophisticated of such facilities around the world. Operations Call Center, which is secretly located, is subcontracted to Deloitte on behalf of government, who staff the call center with telephone operators who are skilled in extracting relevant information out of whistleblowers. and who, upon receiving and recording the calls, document the allegations and send these on to the Public Service Commission, which has an overall responsibility for the functioning of NAC. This hotline receives about 18,000 calls a year. A good deal of those, a good number of those are misplaced calls, people phoning to complain or inquire about government services. And of the calls that are more specific to allegations of corruption, there's also a good number that are declined because of the information being too sparse, or perhaps the allegations being simply too implausible. So it's a vastly reduced number of allegations which the Public Service Commission comes to refer to the relevant departments, government departments, for investigation. It must also be mentioned that over 60% of the allegations are made anonymously, notwithstanding the protection offered by the country's Whistleblowers Act. Fraud, bribery, abuse of government resources, management of government funds, mismanagement, procurement irregularities and appointment irregularities, such as nepotism, they make up almost 70% of the cases that are put forward for investigation. Government departments are instructed to investigate the allegations and are given 40 days to complete the investigations and report back to the Public Service Commission. Then the Commission, after a quality check of the investigation, then submits the investigation report to a special 6-person adjudication panel, of which I'm a member, and we decide on whether the allegation has been adequately investigated and if whether the investigation sufficiently substantiates the allegation or not. And over the past 10 years, where allegations were proven to have substance, this is in 73% of the cases received, led to individuals being charged for having acted in a corrupt way. In 33% of the cases, to dismissals from public service, while others were subjected to suspensions, fines, demotions, and written warning letters. The international experience, however, is that a fairly low percentage of individuals who witness a corrupt act will in fact report on this, even where there is a confidential facility through which to do so. So despite a large number of allegations received by NAC, it can be assumed that these substantially underrepresent the actual number of corrupt officials who witnesses could have reported on. And this cautions us to how effective NAC is as a deterrent to would-be perpetrators of corrupt acts of government. So the NAC, the hotline, the laws, the investigating agencies, and other initiatives I refer to as external measures have, given the persistently high levels of corruption, proven to be somewhat ineffective in discouraging would-be perpetrators of public sector corruption. Let me now refer briefly to measures which are and should be internally introduced by the individual government institution, which, as I say, is after all where the corruption invariably takes place. In this regard, the government has prescribed a number of internal measures, but the problem being that these are generally not purposefully employed. But the situation, I'm pleased to say, is about to change, because from next year, 2050 onwards, the Public Service Commission will be conducting a well-planned annual survey which requires each and every government department to respond online to a range of strategically crafted questions. The website program will automatically allocate scores to the responses, which will allow for the rating of each department and for a comparative report showing the respective anti-corruption efforts and attitudes of each department and government. The survey covers 3 broad areas: promoting ethics through a range of initiatives and practices, the implementation of and management of all financial management systems and practices, as it's within these financial management practices and systems where there are inbuilt mechanisms to curb opportunities for corruption by their inbuilt checks and balances, accounting processes, separations of duties, information controls, and other disciplines. And then thirdly is the focus on the international best and proven practices that an organization should adopt in respect of a well-planned fraud and corruption strategy, which puts separate mechanisms in place to prevent, to deter, to monitor, to investigate, and to respond to corruption, and which raises the risks of perpetrators being caught and punished. The survey also includes a qualitative dimension which records, for example, the extent to which the anti-corruption tone is set from the top, from the head of the department or the permanent secretary level. and what the institution does beyond straightforward compliance when administering these anti-corruption measures. There will be random audits to verify the veracity of the information submitted by departments. The plan is that the results of the survey will each year be released at a high media event, indicating which departments are taking the corruption fight seriously and which are not. This is intended to embarrass those institutions that do not do well in the survey and cause them to try and improve their rankings in future years. The overall short to medium term aim being to raise the internal effort of all departments towards reducing their levels of corruption. Now there's a second part to the story which I hope is of interest to you. In designing the survey, the three focused areas and all the activities within those areas which are necessary, it becomes clear that the survey in fact provides a list of all the important measures the individual organization should be utilizing if they are to be effective in combating corruption. So for me, as the current chairperson of GOPAC's Global Task Force on Parliamentary Oversight, I have taken this list of all these necessary measures and have established how each of these could be an issue for parliamentary oversight and could be built into the oversight work plans of parliamentary committees. And the rationale being that Parliament, through its relevant committees and their oversight mandates, could bring positive pressures to bear on departments to properly implement and manage each of these 30-odd anti-corruption measures. And that's, as such, members of Parliament would be going beyond simply responding to reported cases of corruption and would play a more proactive role in ensuring government institutions raise their efforts to reduce workplace corruption. And I'm hoping that GOPAC will soon begin promoting this more influential level of oversight, and by this encourage members of Parliament to become more engaged in the fight against corruption because, amongst other things, of how it curbs growth for development. Thank you, Chair.
Now, that was an exemplary timing. I didn't use my 2-minute, and neither did I use time up. So I know that the Honourable Irene Ovonji-Odida will do just as well. And I'm also delighted just to comment that I'm particularly proud to chair this gender-balanced panel.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm quite happy to be here as well and to be chaired by you. I thought the remarks you made at the beginning were quite excellent and really set the tone for what is a very important issue, and I thank you for that. I'm here, I've been called to speak on behalf of the panel on illicit financial flows, which is chaired by His Excellency Mbeki, and is a panel that was commissioned by the AU, Council of Finance Ministers, and supported by the UN Economic Commission for Africa. But my interest in this is also because of my work in civil society as the chair of Action Aid International, which is looking at issues to do with tax justice. And there is a very close correlation between the work of the panel and issues around tax justice. As the remarks at the beginning of this session said, development is really about people. It's about citizens. And so the issues we're looking at, corruption and other practices that impact on development, we are really looking at what impacts on people's lives. It's a very real issue for people. It's not a technical subject. It's something that substantively impacts on people's lives. And I think it's really important that as members of Parliament, you are thinking about these issues and thinking through how you can use your power as representatives of people and as officials, public officials who have authority and various tools to ensure that such practices are curbed in order to ensure that everybody participates and benefits from development. There is a growing global spotlight on harmful corporate practices as well as other practices related to illicit financial flows and the financial system globally. We have seen that there is a consensus that aggressive corporate tax avoidance is a problem and that there's a common responsibility of citizens as well as corporate actors to ensure that they pay their fair share, they make their fair contribution to the common good. The Mbeki panel was set up in 2011 to look at the illicit financial flows from Africa. And this was a response by the Council of Ministers of the AU to reports by organizations such as Global Financial Integrity, based in the US, that demonstrated the high level of such flows and the scope of it, the scope of the problem, both globally but also particularly in Africa. This panel has been working since late 2011 and has done consultations across the continent with different key stakeholders, with governments, with heads of state, with relevant ministers, not just ministers responsible for finance and the economy, but also sectors directly impacted by this kind of practice, including agriculture, fisheries, and health, and so on. And it has consulted with other actors in society, including civil society, the business sector, and so on. And the report of the panel is almost finalized and will be presented in January to the AU Summit and thereafter to the Council of Ministers that set up the panel. Apart from this process, we can also see in processes such as the BEPS process under the OECD, which is about base erosion and profit shifting, that there is similar concerns in other parts of the world. And my co-panelists have made reference to some of these, including the concern of citizens in many countries, both in the north, in countries like the US and the UK. In this very country, I think a few weeks ago, there was an outcry, public outcry about tax dodging by corporations such as Starbucks and others. But also in countries like Zambia, we have seen cases where the ordinary person begins to see the relationship between corporate malpractices and the lack of income. They see a connection between that and the state of their lives. And so there has been an outcry in different countries for that reason. Some of the key findings of the Mbeki panel is that illicit financial flows affect countries from every region. So it is not just a problem for Africa, it's a problem for every region, for countries from different parts of the world, from north and south, but particularly a problem for developing countries because of the nature of the economies, because of the size of the economies, and because of the impact, the gravity of the impact. IFFs are usually from three types of activities, and some of these have been discussed in this week. There is commercial practices. We have overt criminal practices, things such as money laundering, trafficking, and so on, and government corruption. And what may be surprising to many of us, it was a surprise to me as well, is that on the face of it, one would expect that corruption accounts for majority of the funds that leave Africa. What has emerged, both from our findings supported by the ECA, but also findings of other organizations, is that corruption accounts for about 5%, that's government corruption, for about 5% of illicit financial flows. Criminal activities such as trafficking, money laundering, account for about 35% of the flows. But commercial practices, by corporate entities, actually contribute to about 65% of those flows. Of course, the issue of corruption fuels all of these, but those are the kind of figures that are emerging and showing the depth of the problem with respect to commercial practices, which are primarily by multinational enterprises. Tax evasion is central to all of them, and we see practices such as abusive transfer pricing, trade mispricing, facilitated by tax havens, and issues related to double taxation treaties, for example. So all of these are the kind of practices that contribute to this issue of illicit financial flows. Another key finding of the panel is that IFF is quite a technical issue, and this probably accounts for the disconnect that many ordinary people, including political leaders, including members of parliament, often have from the issue. It can be very complex, it can be very technical. And this affects issues such as determining its origin, understanding how it is effected, measuring its scale, both because of the complexity, but also because a lot of the practices are secret, and also working out effective regulatory responses. And as I mentioned earlier, because of the complexities involved, you do find that some key professions are often involved in supporting it, in enabling it. And these are drawn from professions such as accounting, banking, lawyers, and so on. The definition that has been used by the panel is money illegally earned, transferred, or used, and that is how we define illicit financial flows. And as I mentioned, some instruments such as double taxation treaties have contributed to the problem depending on how they are worked out, tax incentives, and also financial secrecy jurisdictions or tax havens. The OECD has found that multinational corporations are implicated in BEPS practices, in practices relating to shifting profits across borders, which the first panelist referred to, in which multinational corporations take advantage of tax rates that are lower in jurisdictions other than where their economic activities happen and where their profits are actually made, using various sorts of mechanisms to then transfer the profits outside of those countries where the profits are actually derived, in order to take advantage of low tax rates in those countries. Besides IFF being technical, which makes it quite complex and hard to engage with, but also distances it from many people, it is also political. IFF is quite political, and understanding the political economy of it is key to ending it. And this is because of a number of reasons. One of them is that it often takes place because of a nexus, a combination, an interaction between powerful actors who may be economic actors, such as multinationals, but also political actors, government officials, political leaders, who work together to then enable IFFs to happen. And so resolving it requires high-level political commitment. The other thing about the politics and the political economy of IFF is there is a need to disentangle and understand some of the areas, such as the financial system and the shadow financial system that enables it. And I really am glad that you made a reference to the tax havens and the connection between those and the UK, for example. Because quite often when we think about tax havens, what comes to mind are places in the Caribbean, some other emerging ones, perhaps in Dubai, possibly Mauritius. But then the connection between those and quote-unquote respectable jurisdictions is not often realized. And so the role of countries like the Netherlands, the role of the UK and others, the kind of practices that you may see in the Jersey Islands, what you may see in some states in the USA, New Jersey, Delaware, and so on, and how they enable or how they are used, how those kind of jurisdictions are used by multinational entities, are things that don't often come to the public spaces. So disentangling that and getting the details, the facts on that is also important in order to stop the practice of IFF. But this is something that requires leadership, that requires political will, because of the nature of the actors involved and the high level at which a lot of these practices happen. The high-level panel found that the typical economic sectors affected by IFF in Africa are, the obvious cases. One would think about natural resources, extractives, the mining sector, but also agricultural products, aquaculture, and non-typical sectors such as services and intangibles. What is the cost of doing nothing? If we walk away from this issue, if as parliamentarians you do not engage on it, whether parliamentarians from Africa or from elsewhere, what will happen? Just looking at the scale of the problem and the estimates that have been done, we can see the impact of this on development will be huge and will continue to be huge. The conservative estimate of the ECA is that IFS from Africa amount to about $50 billion per annum. And this is a conservative estimate. And some comparisons have been made of projections, For example, Africa's capital stock would have expanded by up to 60%. Africa's per capita GDP would be up to 15% more if IFFs were not happening. The ratio of domestic investment to GDP would be increased by 19% if IFFs were stopped. And a study that has been done to look at the impact of IFFs on achievement of the MDGs show that it has a direct impact on health, it's had a direct impact on education because of the loss of funds that could be used for services. And without the loss of these resources, we would see drops in infant mortality, in child mortality, in maternal mortality, and achievement of the MDGs much faster. And the other thing about IFF is that they mask and distort the realities of the economic relationship between Africa and other source countries and destination countries that are primarily the richer countries. So the spirit behind global efforts to promote domestic resource mobilization, partnerships for aid effectiveness are undercut by IFFs. So coming to what can you do, what can governments do, because I have a minute left, I think quite clearly one of the things that need to be done is repatriation of stolen funds. When we met with governments and other sectors in North Africa, for example, in Tunisia, there was quite a lot of anger at how, in spite of being able to track and show that funds were taken out of Tunisia during the change, the transition in the government, Tunisia, the government has not been able to have the funds repatriated. And this is a story that plays out in many other countries as well. Some of the things that can be done include improving governance and accountability to citizens. And a lot of what has been said this morning are things that contribute to that. Ending opaque and deliberately badly structured resource extraction contracts would be some of the things to do. Ensuring parliamentary oversight over some of those contracts. Mainstreaming transparency requirements in contracts of that nature. Ensuring that in any engagement, that in laws that exist in countries relating to government official decision making, there is transparency built in. Secondly, it is important to strengthen regulatory capacities, including resourcing of key administrative bodies, customs, tax, immigration, and so on, because a lot of the practices that happen occur because of incapacities and lack of resources of those administrations to monitor and regulate what is taken out. In a number of countries, Zambia was a case that came to mind, DRC and others, it was mentioned, Liberia, it was mentioned that natural resources are taken out of the country and it's the public officials do not have the tools or the equipment to actually monitor how much is leaving. But in some cases, like the case we saw in South Africa, it is also because of policies that are on the table that allow for self-reporting by multinational corporations in certain sectors, like in the diamond sector in South Africa. So there is a need to strengthen regulatory capacity so that governments can actually see how much business is being generated, what are the profits being generated by various entities. And I'll just say 2 or 3 last ones. There is a need to promote global cooperation because actions need to be taken by governments themselves within Africa, and this panel is a first step towards that. But in addition, as discussed in the previous panel through the questions, there is a role for external governments to play because a number of the actors, including the multinational corporations, come from the developed countries. So there is a need for global cooperation to stop aggressive tax avoidance and trade mispricing, and through legislation to ensure that companies are held to account for what they do, both in their own countries where they are originally registered, but also in countries where they derive profit. And the OECD BEPS process is a start, but much more needs to happen within it to ensure that the benefits of that process around transparency are available not just to the OECD members, but also to countries from outside the OECD. And that would need looking at how the OECD agreements are structured so that the information is useful to the countries outside the OECD. And finally, in conclusion, what I'd like to just reiterate is that IFF is technical, but it's also political. The enablers are power and the nexus between political and economic elites. And these contribute to driving the process, to ensuring opaqueness, to ensuring impunity for actions that ultimately impact on every citizen. The cost of it is developmental, it is also political, and it results in distortion of the global economy, but also distortion of the true relationship between African states, African economies, and the rest of the world, primarily the destination countries of IFFs. It is something that requires political action. The benefits of it are not just to Africa, the benefits are also to the rest of the world, because the companies involved in these kind of practices ultimately end up not paying taxes anywhere for the most part. We need global cooperation for this in order to ensure that stability and development is increased in Africa and in the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irene. Can I thank each of our three speakers at this stage, because I think this session is really concentrating on where we go next. I think it's been clear from everyone who has spoken that we have a joint problem. This is a problem which we all have a responsibility to solve, and all the actors in this room are in a position to make a contribution to that. And I particularly welcome the comments made by each of the three speakers about, so what's the solution? How do we grapple this? So we've got